This program is provided by Universal Genesis.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're on what I think is a truly fascinating mission.
It's a big one.
It is. We're going to trace the hidden lines connecting the hard facts of military geography.
Right, the stuff on the ground.
The cold necessities of government bureaucracy, and then how all of that ultimately decides the fate of philosophy in the Islamic Empire.
It sounds like a huge topic, but the source material gives us this really sharp focus. We're not just listing names and dates.
We're looking at the structure.
Exactly. What you need to grasp from the start is this fundamental contrast between the Islamic East and the West.
Okay, lay that out for us, because that's really the starting point for this whole deep dive.
So in the East, we're talking Baghdad, Syria, Mamluk Egypt. The state became highly centralized, very bureaucratic. And it had to be.
A necessity.
A necessity.
Yeah.
And because of that, this complex state had a pragmatic initial need for tools like logic, math, philosophy, just to run itself.
Okay. And the West.
The West, so the Maghreb and especially Andalus, Islamic Spain, the states there were just, simpler, less centralized.
They didn't have that same institutional demand for it.
Far less. So the question isn't were there smart people? Of course there were. It's about why the government itself, the architecture of the state, either welcomed rationalism as a tool or eventually saw it as a threat.
We're looking for the why behind the policy.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get into it. So the sources point to this big, almost universal historical theory that seems to govern all of this.
It really is a meta-theory. It applies way beyond the caliphate. The core thesis that just jumps out is that real political power, true independence, almost always begins at the frontier.
The edge.
The edge facing the biggest, most existential external enemies.
That sounds simple, but why the frontier? Why not the capital?
It's a concentration of resources and power. Think about it. The frontier is where the military has to be.
Mm-hmm.
It's where the money is concentrated, whether it's local taxes or spoils of war. And crucially, it's where administrative autonomy is just. Granted, the capital can't respond fast enough.
So the general on the frontier who's actually stopping the invasion holds all the cards.
He holds the real power, not some courtier back in the capital.
And this pattern, you can see it repeating everywhere, right? The sources give examples.
Oh, absolutely. Look at Tang Dynasty China. The central government created these judushi. They were regional military governors.
Oh.
Their job was to hold the northern borders against the Turks. To do that, they were given control over everything. The army, the taxes, civil administration. They became too strong, too far away, and eventually they broke the dynasty.
And there's a parallel in Japan, which is maybe less familiar.
Yeah. The warrior class, the bushi, they didn't rise up near the imperial court in Kyoto. They rose in the east.
The frontier.
The frontier against the indigenous Ainu people. This constant state of war created a warrior society that eventually took over the whole country with the Kamakura shogunate. Power shifted from the court to the frontier.
Which brings us to our focus, the Islamic East. And here, the Mamluks are the perfect example.
Absolutely perfect. The Mamluk system, it means owned or slave, started with Turkic slave soldiers brought in by the Abbasids.
Around the 9th century.
In the 9th century on, yeah. And they evolved into this incredibly professional military institution based in Egypt. Their entire existence was shaped by a single massive external threat.
The Mongols.
The Mongol invasions coming from the east, the Ilkhanate. This wasn't just about one battle.
Not just Angelut in 1260.
Exactly. That famous battle where they stopped the Mongols, it didn't end the threat. It just formalized a permanent, high-stakes military frontier.
So to survive, the state had to change.
It had to become a highly centralized, complex, military bureaucratic state. The whole system was optimized for one kind of fight, massive professional cavalry versus cavalry.
So that's the key takeaway for the East. The Mongol threat forced the creation of a complex state.
Yes. And the West Andalus, the Maghreb, they just didn't face anything on that scale. Their fights were mostly internal squabbles or smaller border wars.
So they never needed that Mamluk-style state machine.
They remained structurally simpler.
Yeah.
And that right there is the geographic seed for the massive difference in their intellectual lives.
Okay, to really get why the Abbasid state was so complex, we have to look at what came before it. The sources are really clear that the initial model of governance,
The one from the Prophet Muhammad's lifetime.
right, Based on his charisma and on tribal contracts, it was just too fragile for an empire.
It was a special state. I mean, it wasn't designed for imperial administration. It collapsed almost as soon as he died.
Which leads to the Umayyads in Damascus.
The Umayyad Caliphate, from 661 to 750, you can think of them as an intermediate state. They were trying to bridge that gap.
But they were unstable.
Deeply. Their biggest problems were internal. Arab versus Arab. Their military was still just a collection of Arab tribes, and their biggest failure was clinging to this idea of Arab superiority.
Alienating pretty much everyone else.
Exactly. The Mawali, the non-Arab converts. You had these highly educated Persians and Syrians who were Muslims but were treated like second-class citizens. The whole tribal military model was just primitive. It couldn't run an empire.
So even with some innovations like currency reform, they just couldn't solve the problem of scale.
Precisely. And that failure leads directly to the Abbasid Revolution in 750.
Which was basically a total rejection of the Arab tribal model.
A massive rejection. And the first sign was the capital move.
From Damascus to Baghdad. Why?
Well, think about geography. Mecca, Medina, even Damascus. They're not centers for a world empire.
No agricultural base, not enough water.
Exactly. No strategic position to control Persia. Baghdad, though, was purpose-built in Mesopotamia, the ancient, rich, high-population center of civilization.
So the Islamic Empire essentially becomes a Mesopotamian empire.
In an instant.
Yeah.
And if the empire is Mesopotamian, the administration has to become Persian.
Because that's who lived there.
Right. The Arabs were a tiny minority, maybe 5 or 10% in some of these core regions. The people who knew how to run things, the bureaucrats, the tax collectors, were the inheritors of the Sasanian Persian system.
So the Abbasid bureaucracy was basically just the Sasanian system with a new coat of paint.
It was a direct inheritance. The Diwan, the tax registers, the postal service, all of it was Sasanian. It was sophisticated.
What does that mean, sophisticated, in practice?
It means they had systems, they had land surveys for complex taxation, professional record keepers, institutional finance. It required specialized language and logic.
Which leads to this language problem that the sources point out. Arabic, the language of poetry and religion, didn't have the words for this.
It's such a crucial insight. Arabic came from a non-urban, non-agricultural culture. It just lacked the vocabulary for treasury management or bureaucratic hierarchy.
So they had to invent it.
This imperial Arabic had to be artificially constructed. And who built it? Persian scribes. They translated their own Sasanian administrative concepts into Arabic. The language of faith was Arabic, but the language of state, the engine, was Persian.
Okay, so this new Persian-led bureaucracy, it's pragmatic, it's complex, and it needs systematic knowledge. This is the soil for the Golden Age.
Exactly. They welcomed Greek knowledge not because they were curious about metaphysics, but because it was useful. Logic helps you run an administration. Math helps you collect taxes.
It's all functional.
Totally functional. And this sets up the great intellectual conflict that follows. What's so fascinating is that the split wasn't about ethnicity. Avicenna and Ghazali were both Persian. It was about era and occupation.
Their jobs determined their philosophy.
Completely. Let's start with Avicenna ibn Sina. He lived from 980 to 1037, the practical rationalist.
Then what was his job?
He was a man of power, a vizier, basically a prime minister, and a court physician in these smaller, independent Persian states. He was all about practical execution.
So how does that affect his view of philosophy?
For him, philosophy was the architecture that made his job possible. You can't be a great doctor without logic. You can't run a state without a systematic understanding of cause and effect.
It's a tool.
A vital tool for governing and healing. All that other metaphysical stuff that didn't help run the state or cure a patient, he wasn't interested.
And his era matters too. He lived and died before the First Crusade, a time of confidence.
Exactly. Now, you contrast him with Ghazali, lived 1058 to 1111, the ideological bureaucrat.
His job was totally different. He was a professor at the Nizamiya College in Baghdad under the Seljuk military regime.
A central religious official. His job wasn't to run a local state. It was to protect Sunni orthodoxy for the entire complex empire.
Why was that so important?
Because the Seljuk regime was facing massive threats. Internal divisions and externally, the First Crusade, which happened right in the middle of his career. They needed absolute ideological unity to hold the state together.
So Avicenna sees philosophy as a functional tool, and Ghazali sees it as a potential threat to that unity.
A threat to the state's legitimacy. And the sources are very specific about what he attacked.
What were the points of conflict?
Ghazali zeroed in on 3 of Avicenna's ideas, which came from his reading of Aristotle. First, The idea that the world is eternal,
which contradicts creation from nothing.
fundamentally. Second, the idea that God only knows universals, not particulars, meaning God doesn't know about every single person or your individual thoughts.
Wow. That would just gut the whole idea of religious accountability.
Completely. If God doesn't know the particulars, the whole system of reward and punishment collapses. The state's religious mandate vanishes. Ghazali saw this as an existential threat to the community's cohesion.
So he had to prioritize ideological correctness, the state doctrine, over this kind of rational inquiry.
He had to. It's the ultimate split, isn't it? Avicenna is worried about making the machine work. Ghazali is worried about making the people believe in the machine.
Their arguments were running on parallel tracks. They never really intersect.
Never. Avicenna, the vizier, is thinking about tax policy. Ghazali, the theologian, is thinking about ideological cohesion. And that defensive mindset in the complex Eastern state ultimately pushes formal philosophy out. It found a home in the simpler, less threatened West and Andalus.
Which, ironically, is how it gets transmitted back into Europe. So this deep dive has really shown us that the destiny of an idea, whether it gets embraced or crushed, often comes down to things like military necessity and tax policy.
Not just a debate in a library. The need for that complex state in the East, driven by the Mongol frontier, created the bureaucracy. And that bureaucracy, when it felt threatened, chose religious unity over rational tools.
Pushing philosophy out.
Which brings us right back to the beginning. We said that independence always starts at a single point on the frontier where power breaks away.
Right, so here's the final thought then. If the state is just breaking down from the edges, why do empires actually fall completely?
The sources suggest something really provocative, that independence isn't a single event, it's a domino effect. The success of that first breakaway general on the frontier proves to everyone else that the center is terminally weak.
It's a signal.
It's a catalyst. That first break creates a concentric circle of decentralization that spreads inward. It just confirms the center's vulnerability, and the empire eats itself from the edges inward until the whole thing collapses.
The structural breakdown is definitely something to mull over. We'll see you on the next deep dive.
This program is provided by Universal Genesis.